Tony, with all of the different facets of ministry that you're engaged in, preaching, teaching, writing, church planting, which one of those gives you the greatest satisfaction?
The greatest satisfaction is being a pastor of a local church. I love preaching, but I love preaching in the context of the local church. I love to shepherd from the pulpit. I love church planting, but there comes a point where your church plant's now just a church. It's no longer a plant. And I got into church planting not so much because I love church planting, but I love the local church, and I wanted to start a new church that would become a healthy church. And so, and even my teaching, I love teaching because I love to teach disciplines that are directed toward the local church. And so for me, that's the center of everything.
I know you had some experience in seminary that had a profound shaping influence on you in terms of your thinking about the church and about church planting in particular. What was it that led you to plant a church rather than to connect to an existing church?
So I became a Christian in college, went to New Orleans Baptist Seminary, didn't know what I wanted to do, knew I wanted to proclaim the gospel. And I was in my second semester at this time thinking, I'm probably not a senior pastor type. Maybe I should do campus ministry or some type of evangelistic ministry. But then I was taking a class on church administration of all classes and began to think through everything from insurance to parking lots to budgets, deacons, and it was a really wonderful semester for me of learning because I came with almost like a blank slate on church life. And so I began to analyze all of these categories and thinking to myself, like, what's the best way to do all of these, you know? And as I looked at other churches, there are obviously deficiencies in every church, but I began to think about it. What would I do differently? And if I had the chance to just start from the ground up, what would this look like? And then at the same time, I was reading a Spurgeon biography, and Spurgeon was giving me a real romantic love for the church. And I was taking systematic theology, and this particular semester I was really diving into ecclesiology, which was helping shape my understanding of the church from a biblical theological framework. And so all that together became a very formative semester as a sense of Spirit working in me to cultivate both a love for the church and also an interest in planting a new church and starting a new church. At the time, there wasn't as much emphasis on church planting as there is today. And so when some of our professors moved on to new ministry assignments, I was kind of left without a mentor, a lot of practical direction on church planting. So I actually did go to a couple of established churches and spent short time pastoring those congregations. Went through Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, had a whole history of, a whole story there that I could go into. Long story short, eventually 4.5 years ago, we moved to Raleigh to plant a church that really I've wanted to plant for over 10 years. But I'm grateful the Lord allowed me to plant at age 34, rather than when I was first starting this, because I think I had a whole lot to learn in that 10-year period of time. And so looking back, I just see God's hand at work in a variety of these ways, working in us to get to this point.
How old is the plant now, or the church? It is now not a plant anymore.
That's right. We had this discussion a lot, like, when do we stop calling ourselves a church plant, you know? So we're 4.5 years old currently. I moved to Raleigh. May will be 5 years, so we're looking at a couple months away from 5 years of being there.
And as you evaluate those 4.5, 5 years, are there things that you would do differently if you were starting now?
I think we would. I think there's some things we should have thought through a little more carefully than we originally did. I think we got a lot of stuff right, some by design, some by accident. Location is a big one, I think, for church planters to. Every city's different. You know, every church plant has its own challenges, but where you decide to gather weekly, I think is really important, probably more important than I realized, especially if you think you are particularly suited to reach a particular people group in your city, to be really careful about about where to go. We've moved 3 times, and we still need another space because we've outgrown our current facility. But we started meeting in my home, doing a Bible study that grew to about 45 people, and so we had to get a space to gather. And we just kind of took a space that we could afford, which, again, wasn't wrong necessarily or even bad, but once we began to meet in that place for a season, it kind of locked us into a geographic region in terms of people that were coming. And so I just think that part is important. Selecting your team is very important, and who's going to be part of this church plant team. I think selecting leaders is a really important dynamic of church planting, like to be really slow in appointing people to leadership, to try to protect the health of the church. But overall, even despite some of our failures, we just see God's grace at work, and we rejoice that He uses us.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to watch, over the various eras in the history of the church, that there are different strategies that come to the forefront for evangelism, for spreading the gospel. I mean, some of us are old enough to have lived through the kind of the mass evangelism, stadium evangelism sorts of things, which is still going on, but not to the same degree. Church planting is clearly the evangelism strategy for the 21st century, at least at this point. Do you feel that is rightful in its place as kind of the predominant means of evangelism anymore?
Yes, I don't think so. I would put alongside of church planting what we call network evangelism, which network evangelism and hospitality evangelism, which we kind of use together, have really been our means by which we have seen converts, and then in the worship gathering, preaching the gospel to these who've been invited by those who practice in hospitality, who have invited people in their networks. This has really been the most successful means of evangelism. Now, we do have the people that do door to door. We have people that regularly go to the parks and just start talking to people, But what we've tried to emphasize is we tell our folks to look for 5 networks: your family, your neighborhood, your vocation, recreation, where you play, and then where you shop, commercial. Think in those 5 networks and try to identify at least 5 people in each of those networks, and try to do one of 5 things. Pray for them, and we try to give them easy on-ramps for evangelism. And if you just pray for these people that you're seeing all the time, give literature to them, books, serve them, invite them either to a gathering or to your home, something like that, and then finally preach the gospel to them, like literally tell them the gospel. And we've seen a lot of fruit in people just trying to think more intentionally about who's already in my path, because a lot of people, when they hear evangelism, I think they think I've got to add something else to an already full schedule. And while that is true maybe to a degree, I think if we would just learn to live with intentionality with the people that are already in our paths, where we shop regularly, where we eat, where we work out or play, whatever. God has given us a lot of people to minister to if we'll just be deliberate about trying to reach out to them in various ways. So that has really fed into our church plant culture, I think. And so that, and then using hospitality as another practical, ordinary ministry of outreach. So church planting, the challenge in church planting, I think today, it may not be so much in cities like Minneapolis or other major urban areas that are not in the Bible Belt. The challenge in Raleigh is, I often say, it's in the South, but it's not of the South. We have a lot of transplants, a lot of internationals, a lot of students. We have people regularly at our church who have never been to a worship service before. But still, we do have enough people that are transfer growth. And what happens in a church plant is when numerical growth gets to be so large, you find yourself as a pastor trying to shepherd and manage this numerical growth that's actually taking me away from evangelistic growth. And so in some ways, numerical growth can be an obstacle, I think, to evangelistic growth. And I think the challenge is once the church begins to grow is to keep our eye outward, to keep thinking about how do we do hospitality, how do we reach our neighbors. And so all that to say, I think there are a lot of layers to church planting in evangelism, and it can be an effective evangelism strategy, but I would also want to caution guys in thinking that just because you go plant a church doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see a lot of converts. There are other aspects of evangelism you should consider and be emphasizing, if that makes sense. In other words, like don't just rent a storefront and think, man, people are going to start coming to
if
Christ.
You build it, they will come.
Exactly, exactly. It's still, we've got to be out in the culture. And if any lost person is in our gatherings on Sunday, it's because somebody invited them. Someone reached out to them in their networks. It's not because they woke up on Sunday and said, I'd really like to find a church today. Rarely will that sort of thing ever happen. If they're there, it's because our people have been living a missional lifestyle, during the week.